Welcome to the Act Out Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Tomlin. Today's guest is Iranian democracy advocate Zolal Habibi. Let's roll the tape. Hey, Zolal, how are you?
Hi, how are you doing? It's a pleasure to be with you.
Same here. I've been excited to talk to you ever since I saw you on the schedule. So this is definitely going to be a lot of fun today.
Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation. And please allow me to greet those who are tuning in to the podcast today.
So, if kind of just a very brief introduction, what's your name and what do you do?
My name is Zolal Habibi, and I am a member of the NCRI Foreign Affairs Committee. The NCRI is the National Council of Resistance of Iran. It's the parliament in exile of the Iranian resistance dedicated to the overthrow of the current regime. And we promote, the human rights situation in Iran and stand for a secular democratic republic in Iran.
And how long have you been outside of Iran?
Actually, I'm part of the generation that has never actually had the opportunity to be in Iran. I was born and raised in the U.S. My parents came to the U.S. before the revolution.
Can you kind of break down like today's political landscape in Iran? What is the type of government and like how many political parties are there and are there elections?
Well, we have a theocracy in Iran. So it's not a classical dictatorship, it's a religious dictatorship. It's supposed to be a republic, but it's actually the Vilayat al-Faqih, which means the supreme leader. So the system is built that there's, instead of I guess it's kind of like a, classical dictatorship, like a monarchy, you would have like the king. They have the supreme leader, which is like a religious figure or ideological figure for the regime. And then they have their different branches. So they have like a president,
Mm-hmm.
they have like the parliament, they have their judiciary, they have a council of elite, which is the council that decides on who becomes the supreme leader. And then they have like a guardian council. It has a parliament which is supposed to have like elections every 2 years. So if you look at it like by, textbook standards, it has all of those things in it, like checks and balances of things. But the reality is that everyone is approved by the Guardian Council. So there isn't anyone who opposes it. So there isn't they try to present themselves as having different factions or whatever, but they're all, have, sworn to be, you know, loyal to the supreme leader. And so the whole system is, it's a dictatorship. So it's not, there isn't really, I mean, it's sham elections, really. They have still, there's no such a thing as an election in Iran. And the reality is that, that's why we always have said that there's no reform possible in this system, because a viper never gives birth to a duck. So it's not going to be very different throughout the years, or even throughout, with whoever comes and goes, the same way that, Khomeini, he ruled, Khomeini continued that, and right now, Moshe seems to be in a coma, but I mean, it's the same system. It's not, there isn't any difference between that.
So it's checks and balances on paper, but not in practice.
Yeah, exactly. Everything is decided by the supreme leader, and everything is just the supreme leader. They actually have, even to be able to support the whole system, they have like the IRGC, which is, in Iran, we kind of have like two militaries. One is the classical military that you would have to protect the borders, and then you have the IRGC, which is there to protect the supreme leader and the whole system. That is something that you see, which is different than a lot of other places.
Okay, so like you were talking about elections, but they're sham elections. So let's say that you and I are in Iran and we are wanting to run for some political office. I have pledged my support to the Ayatollah, and I'll be in lockstep with them. And you are part of the like the counteraction of the revolutionary, so to speak. And so whenever we go to file our paperwork, the council is going to accept me and allow me to probably run since I am approved, but they're going to deny you, right? Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, but it's a bit more than that. I mean, it's not going to be an issue of just being denied for me. It would probably mean, like,
Oh,
arrest and execution because I am from the opposition. So that is the thing. 120,000 people have been executed in Iran for supporting the Iranian resistance, and even right now there are people who are on death row or in prison
hmm.
for some kind of affiliation with the Iranian resistance. Just unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, actually 6 political prisoners were executed in Iran for affiliation with the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. So this is something that's been continuous since 1981 till now. So yeah, that is the situation.
And so in the 80s, the Ayatollah Khomeini, am I saying that right? He has, is it a fatwa? Is that what it's called? Whenever like a proclamation?
Mhm.
And so that proclamation was essentially anyone who is in this opposition party, the Mujahideen, or has expressed views that are sympathetic to them, needs to be killed or should be executed. It's something very, very finite. Uh, and if I'm not mistaken, the judiciary or whoever's supposed to carry it out, whenever they first read it, were like, we had to ask questions like, does this count for people who are currently serving right now? Does it count for people who have just been, like just been accused? I mean, it was this whole blanket sweep. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, to go back on that a bit, at first in 1981, Khomeini had declared on the radio, and that anyone who is in any way affiliated with this group, you could kill them at point blank on the street. You don't even have to. There's no need for a trial or anything, and that's why
Mm.
June 20th, 1981, when that he made that statement. Unfortunately, that same day, at least 3,000 people were executed in Iran. And since then, executions like they were carried out. I know people who were in prison at that time. They were like 16, 17 years old at that time. They were in prison. They said they would count the coup de grace fired every night. Just in every prison, there will be about 200, 300 people every single night. And just imagine that throughout the country. But in 1988, as you mentioned, it was right at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. Khomeini knew that for 8 years, he had been able to suppress everything internally by saying, we have a foreign enemy, we're at war, so you need to just, keep quiet. And they knew that the minute this war comes to an end, people are going to rise up. They're going to want change. They're going to demand that change. And they're just fed up with the situation. So they needed something to spread fear. So Khomeini gave this fatwa, as you said. It's a one-page handwritten note by Khomeini. We still have that copy of it, actually. And in it, it says, all of them should be executed. And that, as you mentioned, there were questions because some of these people had been in prison for 6, 7 years. Some had, or 8 years even. Some had finished their prison terms. They just hadn't been released yet. Some were just, in a state of limbo. They really didn't have anything against them. It was just like, for instance, for family affiliation, or for instance, when they were in high school back like in 1981, they had a pamphlet or a newspaper, which at the time was not illegal. And they were in prison. So a lot of those things actually continued to remain. And so that's why they had questions. And on the other hand, they were just asked, so these committees were formed, the death committees, what we call the death committees. And it would be a team of 3 or 4 people representing the intelligence ministry, the clergy, and the judiciary. And they would just ask people the people didn't know that they were being, this is kind of like a trial or anything. They would just be asked
Hmm.
4 questions based on like some people, they would just ask one question. If they answered that question not the way the regime wanted, they would be taken to they would be led to the line for the executions. And it was just done immediately, like that fast. They were asked like, what is your charge, or what is your political affiliation? If they said the Mujahideen, you would be immediately taken to be executed. So they were just asked like 3, 4 basic questions, and based on that, they were taken to the gallows, automatically. And as I said, in 5, 6 weeks, they had over 30,000 people executed. And that is how Khomeini was able to spread fear in society, because you can imagine, at that time, Iran's population was a lot less than it is today. And so every family either knew someone who had been executed or had lost a loved one. And so that's how Khomeini was able to spread fear in society, to show that it sees no borders. And unfortunately, the atrocities perpetrated by this regime over the years, I mean, they have shown time and time again that they see no borders when it comes to these executions. And I think one thing that's important to note, since last summer till now, a few of the top figures in this regime, top officials, have made mentions of the 1988 massacre and the need to repeat those executions. After the January uprising, one of the regime officials on, official state television said, "We need to create a Khalbanon in every province." Khalbanon is the name of the mass grave in the 1988 massacre. And the fact that he said, we need to create a Khalbanon in every province if we want to keep control over society, that was, they were like, why didn't you? They were actually criticizing the regime. This was like internal criticism of the regime. Why did you have 50,000 people arrested? You should have just had them killed in the street. That was, that was their message. And last week, Ejei, who is the current head of the judiciary in the regime, has said that we need to expedite the execution sentences and the executions for the protesters and the political prisoners.
So, is the I guess has it just been a massive campaign to dehumanize the this opposition part, the Mujahideen, since 1981 or even before then?
Yes, this was actually, I think you actually touched on a very good point, because this is something that most people just don't immediately pick up on. But from the very onset, Khomeini, when he came into power, he knew that, the reality on the ground was this revolution was created by the younger generation of Iran at the time, who were, part of progressive movements. Those progressive movements, the heads of those progressive movements, a lot of them have been executed, but the ones who were remaining, they were still imprisoned in the final weeks of the Shah. So Khomeini was able to hijack the revolution because they were still in prison. And once they were released, Khomeini knew that he didn't have the capability to create like a, run a true state. So he was counting on being able to create like maybe a coalition with them in a way, or have them, because they had a good reputation among the people, to be able to utilize them to actually set his, have his power. But from the beginning, especially, he concentrated on Mujahideen, because there were leftist groups, and then there was the Mujahideen who, they were progressive, but they were Muslims too. So it was something that the regime needed in a way. So from the first day on, the Mujahideen were like, no, we did not have a revolution for Islam. We had a revolution for democracy in Iran. And we, even though we're Muslims, we believe in a secular state. And we believe that there's no force in religion. And so we're not going to go under, this Vilayat al-Faqih and this nonsense of having a supreme leader in Islamic State. And in fact, they did not vote for the constitution of the regime. And that was the turning point for Khomeini. So at that time, actually, there were supposed to be elections held for the presidency. And so the Mujahideen had their candidate for presidency, Masoud Rajavi, and Khomeini said, well, you didn't vote for the supreme leader or like having this system, so you can't take part in the elections. Thinking that they would be like, okay, fine, we'll agree to it. And they're like, well, no, we don't agree to it. And so that is when, everything fell apart. And since then, Khomeini, there's actually an audio file or video actually of Khomeini saying that if 1 in a million, I would give the chance that the MEK would back off of their principles and what they stand for, I would be
Mhm.
work with them, but they're not. And so from that, and that's one thing that we take pride in, the fact that we never cooperated with Khomeini. And from day one, we said, the revolution was for the freedom of the people of Iran, not to create a religious state or a theocracy.
Mm.
And so Khomeini had that hatred. And so since on June 20th, 1981 was like the turning point, that there was a peaceful
Mhm.
protest at the time in Tehran. 500,000 people came and it was spontaneous. It was in regards to, at the time, Bani Sad was like the president of Iran, and Khomeini was trying to, have him deposed or whatnot. So they protested in regards to, you can't take away these freedoms that you have promised the people of Iran. And that protest turned, unfortunately, Khomeini turned it into a bloodbath, and that was like the turning point. And since that day on, the resistance had to go underground and to be able to continue its fight with the regime, because for a year and a half, actually 2.5 years, they tried every possibility to be able to create reform within this regime and try to somehow save the revolution that they had created against dictatorship. But that was like the point that they realized it's not possible with Khomeini.
The Khomeini, before he assumed power, like he kind of went around to like European countries and kind of made himself out to be this person of like, I'm going to be a reformer. There's going to be more like kind of like liberal democratic elements to it. And was that all just to try to build the coalition inside? Like he had no intention of doing that.
Well,
Is that,
he
I
was
guess?
trying to get the approval of the West to put him into power. Khomeini, he was in exile for 20 years in Iraq. The 6 months, the 6 final months, he was in France. Um, and at that time, it was the Cold War era. So, and the international community was realizing that the Shah is on the brink of falling, especially after September 1878, when the Shah opened fire on protesters and
Mm.
throughout the country, and over 1,000 people were killed that day on the street. So a lot of people try
Jeez.
to give you this image of, oh, the Shah just left and because he didn't want to see bloodshed. No, he tried his best to suppress the revolution with bloodshed, and when that didn't give the response that they were hoping for, that is when he started detracting. But at that point, that was 6 months before the revolution, people, the international community realized that this regime is on the verge of falling apart. It's not going to be able to keep itself afloat with these nationwide uprisings at the time. And so they got into negotiations they were looking to, like, what is the solution? Because they understood that those who had created this revolution were progressive movements. On the other hand, it was the Cold War era, so Iran is bordering USSR, so they're like, where are they going to align themselves and whatnot? So they wanted to, I guess, bet on the horse that they thought was, going to be to their benefit. And so they figured Khomeini, he's a fundamentalist, he's supposed to be a religious figure, he is against communism, so he's our best bet probably. And Khomeini also,
Mm.
he said, I will allow the freedom of parties and freedom of speech, and I'm just a religious figure, a clergy. I'm not looking for power. I'm more of a fatherly figure because of my old age, and I'm going to go to Rome and continue my studies once I return to Iran. And that never happened. And so
Mm.
that's why, like, for instance, today when sometimes you see here the son of the Shah saying that let's not get stuck in the labels. I am just like he also uses the term, I'm just a father figure for people, and people just because I'm my father's son and whatever, people want me, and I don't want power. I don't have any interest in power. I'm like, we've heard that once before, and your actions speak otherwise. So let's see
Right.
that. So yeah, that is the situation when it comes to 1979 and Khomeini coming into power.
And so I guess there, like, what I'm kind of just fascinated with is that it seems like it doesn't matter who is in power or whenever the Iranian people are trying to protest or trying to like have some self-determination, people are like just struck down by very brutal means.
That is unfortunately the case. If you look in the last decade, we've had four major uprisings in Iran, and every time it is met with brutal force. And so you see, like the regime since 2019, especially if you look, the uprising back then, people came to the streets. It was very strong movement. Then the regime shut down the internet for uh, 5, 6 days back then, and they were able to kill in the streets with open hand. 1,500 people were killed at least, and with that, they were able to, hold their grip on the situation. And then 2022, the spark was the unfortunate death of Mahsa Jina Amini for malveiling. The protest began again. It was met with suppression. So after a few months, we saw that end. And then this time around, in January, you saw the nationwide uprisings in Iran, and people came to the streets. They were very defiant. They were really fed up with the situation. People understood. I mean, each time you see it evolve and become more radical, people understood that no one's going to hand us freedom in a silver platter. We have to pay the price for it. And so they were willing to do that, and you could see that in the messages of those who were killed in the protests.
Mhm.
They said, a lot of them, they said their final farewell before going to the street. But they understood that this is the price. This is the price we have to pay for freedom in Iran. And the people of Rome were willing to pay that price. And for 19 days, there was an internet blackout, and the regime had open hands in killing. And then we saw, those scenes of those black bodies. Thousands were killed. It's very difficult to verify the actual numbers. And there are unfortunately others with different types of interests who are playing with those numbers. But for us, it's very important to speak about the actual facts. What we have been able to determine, clearly it's over 3,000. We have the names of over 2,600 people who have been killed in the protest, and the regime committed war crimes in the suppression. They actually went into hospitals and shot people who were wounded and were being treated in the hospital. So they sent their message that, they will do anything to keep their power intact. Since then, there was martial law instated in Iran. But despite that, I think that we saw people continuing to mobilize and organize. A lot of the families, they turned the memorial services or the ceremonies that they had for their loved ones who were killed into forms of defiance and resistance, and making a pledge to their children to continue the fight and to celebrate their lives because they had given up their lives for freedom in Iran. So that was, the regime thought this is how they could spread fear in society, but instead of spreading fear in society, they saw, they were faced with this wave of people having more determination for
Mhm.
the regime, because they understood, like, if we go back into our homes again, then it's going to take another spark, and then there's going to be another cycle of, continuous death and destruction. And that's why we saw, even a week before the start of the war, this is the thing. After the uprisings, the regime had shut down all college campuses. All the classes were held online, because the first group of people who joined the merchants and the bazaar and the uprisings were the students. So
Mm.
universities are usually the hotbed for the uprisings in Iran. They're the elite, they're the youth of Iran. And so on February 22nd, when classes resumed in person, protests started in universities across Iran. So on the first day,
Mm.
they saw that. And for 3 or 4 days, the regime tried to control it. They saw that they weren't able to, so they shut down the campuses again and said, classes will resume again in April. Everything has to be online. At the same time, on February 3rd, we saw a group of 250 members of resistance units resistance units are the underground network of the People's Mujahideen organization inside of Iran that have been something that has come together over the past decade inside of Iran. And they carried out a operation against the headquarters of Khamenei, which is the most secure location in all of Iran at a time that they were on heightened security because they feared a war happening. And they had thousands of suppressive forces securing this location, and they were still able to infiltrate that and go through. So the message for people inside of Iran was like, wow, the regime is much weaker than it tries to present itself. And so that really had a clear message for people inside of Iran. But unfortunately, the war started like 5 days later. So it wasn't, but everyone understood that this is going to be the new norm. This is going to be the new path. We need to have both the protests and the operations together to be able to overthrow this regime. And that is like the direction that we see it going to. And that's why we see like in the last 2 weeks that the regime has kind of realized that, the war is going to be coming to an end soon, hopefully sooner than later. But they've started the execution of political prisoners and protesters because the regime knows that the minute this war comes to an end, it's going to be dealing with a new wave of unrest inside of the country. And that is what they fear the most. So that is why even in the midst of a war, they're not backing off of execution of protesters and political prisoners. 6 of the political prisoners executed were affiliated with the Mujahideen, and 7 of the protesters who were killed were those arrested after January. You see among them people 18, 19, in their early 20s and their early 30s who've been executed, but you also see people in their 60s who have been executed. So the regime is trying to send a message that, first of all, it tells the people of Iran that the regime fears the people more than anything else, because at the end of the day, the Iranian regime knows that it's not going to be overthrown with just bombs over the head. They're not a classical dictatorship. And Iran is a very vast country. And so they understand that, but they know that the force that is going to overthrow them is the people of Iran. And so that's why they are turning to these executions. That's why Ajay has also given this message last week.
It is incredible to me, the bravery of the protesters. Whenever you were talking to me earlier that just about everyone, at one point in time knew someone who had been executed or arrested or, tortured by the regime. And you can see how effective that would be in like quelling protests. Like, you killed my neighbor, you're going to kill me too. I'm going to back off. But even then, though, that fear has its limits, and eventually the desire for freedom is so strong that people will say, like, well, if death is certain, death is preferable to these chains. It's inspiring.
Actually, you touched on a very good point there. A lot of people, like, inside of Iran, first of all, they have this experience because they saw, like, if you look at the past, the few decades, after the 1988 massacre, there was complete silence in Iran for about 11 years until the new generation came into the scene in the 1999 student uprising. And then when that was suppressed, the first major uprising again in Iran was in 2009. So it was a decade in between each of one of these protests. But then you see in the last decade, we've had 4 major uprisings in Iran. So you see that process changing. Also, what's important is that people realize that if I keep on, because this generation, especially the Gen Z of Iran, if you look at them, both them and their parents have grown up under this regime. So they've seen nothing but this regime. The Gen Z of Iran is now looking at their parents and they're like, look, your parents tried to safeguard your lives and they prevented you from joining the resistance or becoming active because they feared so much from what they had seen in the 1980s that they just wanted to safeguard their children. But what does that bring us to today? We are where we are today because there's a price for it. at the end of the day, we have to pay a price for this freedom. And that's why they are realizing that we are those agents of change. We can't be watching, looking at others to create that change for us. We have to bring about that change ourselves. And that's where you have to pay the price for what it is that you're fighting for. And I think that is what we're seeing right now resonate throughout, Iran's society. Also, on the other hand, I think that like the 1980s, you have to understand, on one hand, it was the 8-year war with Iraq, which costed, over 1 million lives on each side of the war. The regime sent 450,000 children to be used as minesweepers in the war. And I mean, a regime that's willing to do that with its future, like they would actually take buses to schools and take like 12, 13-year-old children, 14-year-old children to the mines, to the border area of the war. And they would give them these gold plastic keys and would tell them, this is the key to heaven. So you just put that around your neck. We wrap you up in a blanket and we roll you open on the minefields. And then, when you die, you'll go to heaven. And a government that's willing to do that with its own people, with its own future, like the main asset that you have in your country, you can imagine like the message for the rest of society. So, I mean, at that time, there were a lot of families who decided they're like, you know what, I'm not going to send my children to school anymore. So this war is over, or, just those devastation, and then followed by the 1988 massacre. And before that, you saw I know a lot of children, I mean, a lot of people from like our age, our generation who grew up in Iran during their elementary school years, or even when they were in middle school or high school, they have all practically encountered a public execution at some point in time. Because, like, for instance, they would be going on their way to school, because they would have to walk to school. Then you would see, like, for instance, the main square would be shut down all of a sudden. And so you're stuck there. You can go forward, you can go backwards, and then they carry out a public execution. That's how Khomeini used to set in society. Just imagine being a child and having witnessed that.
Yeah.
The impact that it had on society, and that is how Khomeini was able to keep his grip on power throughout these years. So you have to understand, like, it's very difficult to stand in face of this regime. I think that what we are grateful for is the fact that we have had organized resistance throughout these years, because this regime, with the brutalities that it carried out, could have, under normal circumstances, or if it was in a different era or a different circumstances that there wasn't an organized resistance, it could guarantee its power for about 500 years. But the fact that we didn't allow the flame of resistance to die away, to keep that continuous and to continue to fight this regime and weaken it to a point that it has reached today. It's not something that just happened overnight. This regime has been, this fight has been continuous for decades, and that is what we see in Iran society today. I mean, what is flourishing, what has come about from all of, from decades of continuous struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is what gives people hope. I mean, I think a lot of people, especially the younger generation in Iran, they're like, you know what? If I'm going to I would be willing to sacrifice my life if I could have some kind of guarantee that there will be freedom. I'm willing to make that sacrifice in my own personal life for the country, as a, for the future of this country. But am I willing to do that if I don't have that kind of a guarantee? No, not really. Because we have seen in the past 100 years, like, dictator after dictator. But the fact that there's an organized resistance movement that has withstood the test of time, I think that really helps, because, you're not concentrating on, or you're not really putting your trust into something that is just on paper, or just mere words. It's something that withstood the test of time. It stands, like, for instance, when it says separation of religion and state. This is something that they stand for, and they have been. You see it in practice when they say, we're willing to give everything because for the people's sovereignty. Well, the fact that these people, like some of them, they were teens when they joined this movement, like back in 1979, the revolution, and now they're in their 60s and they're still standing and they're still fighting, day in, day out, constantly for 45
Mhm.
years, 45 years. Um, that's something you could just do. If they were after power, there were easier ways to get it. If they were after, you know, money, there's
Mhm.
easier ways to get it. If they were after name recognition, there would be easier ways to get it. And so that is something that you can trust. And I think that, unfortunately, the greatest crime perpetrated by Khomeini was betraying people's trust. So I think rebuild
Mm.
a very important part of this fight. But there's also, as you mentioned at the beginning, you were saying the amount of propaganda and disinformation that the regime annually puts effort in. Every year they have like a budget of, you know, $20 million, I think, or something like that, for propaganda
Jeez.
against the MEK alone. And that shows, I mean, that for itself speaks for itself, but it's very difficult. It does make things very difficult. And also, if you look, and since if you go back from like Iran Contra till today, at every negotiation table with the regime, the first thing that the regime puts on the table as the bargaining chip is something against the system, limiting their activities, blacklisting them, having them eliminated, you know. And unfortunately, they've always gotten what they wanted, and
Mm.
here we are today. And so, yeah, that is a price that we've paid and continuously continue to pay that price.
It just shows how dispensable the Khomeini or the Ayatollah like sees the people. But what I loved that you said was the flame of resistance, and I think that's one of the best ways of describing it because it's so inspiring when the face of like almost near certain death that so many people are stepping up and fighting. And you're right, it's not about the fame and fortune, but it's just about freedom and freedom for yourself and for your people. I think that's the most noble cause you could get behind.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think each one of us, the day that we made the decision to join this movement, we understood the price, especially like our generation, because we had seen the previous generation, we had seen the price that had been paid by our parents' generation and everything. When we decided to, so we, it was with complete open eyes that we decided to join. I think that for me, I've always believed that there's no greater satisfaction or I think accomplishment that I could have than to be a part of the movement that brings about true democracy.
Mm.
And the fight for freedom in Iran has been continuing for 120 years. And in the revolution, there have been short-lived times that people had a bit of freedom. I think the longest is probably 2 years under Dr. Mossadegh, who was overthrown with a coup d'etat by the CIA and MI6 because he nationalized Iran's oil. And that's
Mm.
one of our, you know, unfortunately, we're a country that's very rich in natural resources, and that has been, we've paid a great price for that. But also, Iran plays a very important geopolitical role. So that is why we see, is there are those who have interest in what happens in Iran, and that's why we've seen all the dictators that we have in Iran have been installed one by one.
Yeah.
From Reza Khan, who was installed by the British, and then when he wasn't serving their purposes anymore, they put him into exile and brought his son. And then his son, for the first year, he had to watch his steps because he was afraid that he would be replaced like his father was. I mean, to the extent that when his father died, he wasn't able to even bring his father back to the country and bury him. But so the first years, he really watched his steps. And then though that allowed the people of Iran to actually have, a prime minister that was elected, and that was Dr. Mossadegh. And but when after the coup d'état against Dr. Mossadegh, the Shah was reinstated, but this time he had complete power. And so
Mm.
he ruled with the sabak and, the suppression. Eliminated from that moment on, he eliminated all parties. He said, we only have one party, and that's the Rastafi's party. If you don't like it, leave the country or you'll be arrested. And he ruled with an iron fist. Today, there are those who try to, you know, present a rosy image of Iran under the Shah, but it's like, imagine in like 40 years, people showing like these videos and things that you see on Instagram of, the rich kids of Tehran and the regime, and be like, look how,
Mm.
amazing Iran was under Khamenei. The goal is like
Yeah.
Khamenei did for Iran. He brought internet, he brought communication and whatnot. I'm like, hello, those are things that come with the times, because some of the things that they tried to boast about, the Shah modernized Iran. I was like, there's electricity and water everywhere in the world. But even then, he did not have that for the entire country. And like, for instance, they're like, he made the railroads. I'm like, do you understand that the railroads were like from south to north instead of being from east to west? It didn't go through the major cities. It was for military use and not for civilian use. But I mean, when the reality is that when the facts aren't there because there was a dictatorship, unfortunately, they used that and they tried to present it differently. But the reality is that the people of Iran haven't forgotten. I mean, we still know people who bear the scars of torture under the Sabak. My father, he was a law student in Tehran University, and he had just graduated at the top of his class. And so the Shah had offered him a job to be a judge, but it would be, he had to be in check with what the Sabak asked him to do and whatever the Shah does. And my dad was like, no, not taking that position.
Mm.
They actually have him arrested for that, for denying that position. And he was in prison for a few months, and back then there was no communication. So like the family was just like, they had no clue where he was. And after
Yeah.
4 months, he was released. And when he went back, my grandfather was like, you need to leave the country as soon as possible. And so my dad had actually gotten a full scholarship for American U to continue his doctorate. So he came to the US then, but and my dad wasn't like a major activist or anything. Yes, he was, he did have progressive views, and he was a,
Hmm.
but he wasn't active. But they actually had him arrested for, just denying a job. And so you can imagine like what the situation was back then. And
Yeah.
so that is just like a glimpse of it. But I have seen, like, there's a mother, we call her Aziz, Mother Mezai. She, 4 of her kids were killed by the Shah, and she was in her early 40s, I guess, at that time. And she was also imprisoned because of her children, not because they had anything against her personally, along with her daughter who was pregnant at the time. And the Shah actually tortured them. Mother Reza, she still has like a hole like in the sole of her feet
Mm.
because of, the tortures and everything, even though she has had like
Hmm.
surgery since then. But those people are still alive, and people are like talking about how great Iran was under the Shah. No, that's not the reality of Iran. The reality, the people have Iran revolted for a reason. It wasn't because they were really too happy, They revolted for a reason.
Hmm.
You can't forget that past. And it was interesting for me yesterday. Mirza Pahlavi was in Sweden, and a reporter asked him, your father's past. Do you think that has effect on you, that you try to present yourself now as like the leader for the transition or whatever? I mean, and first of all, let's be honest, it's not transition for, it's not leader for the transition. I mean, if it was, why do you keep on, you know, reiterating crown prince and calling the king?
Right.
And now you've named your daughter as the, the crowned princess now. So I mean, if you're not into that, on what merit are you standing? Aside from name recognition, and your father was overthrown by the people, so that name recognition doesn't really do you any good. We're not in the, line of recycling dictators right now. But they asked him that, and he said, "I take pride in my family's heritage." Um,
Mm,
that shows me where you stand today, and the fact that he has given, after 47 years of not doing anything, this summer he actually gave a plan, a roadmap for what Iran would look like after he comes into power, and it's um it's devastating. The roadmap, if you read it,
mm.
76 pages, but he calls for the revival of the Savak. He calls for
What is that?
the Savak was the secret police of the Shah. So it was like the suppressive
Mm,
forces that they tortured and executed and everything. The police state was
mm,
run by the Savak. It's and then he calls for the revival of the Imperial Guard, which was the equivalent of the IRGC today. So it's just like rebranding the systems of the current regime.
ah,
And he calls for like having martial law in 20 major cities. And he calls for like a system that is even worse than his father's. Like when you look at it, it's like a completely totalitarian government, and without any checks and balances, because he decides all three, you know, branches and who leads them and who's part of them. And so I'm like, you know what? That does not look like a democracy to us. You could
mm,
brand it however you want, but the people of Iran, I mean, the slogans on the streets speak for themselves. You know, they say no to the crown, no to the turban, yes to freedom and democracy.
mm,
Down with the oppressor, be it the Shah or the mullahs. But there are those who do have interest in having a puppet in power. And so they do promote him, unfortunately. And that's where, you know, that positive achievement and having interest in Iran's natural resources comes into play, I guess.
mm. So it seems like Iran is a pretty diverse country, a lot of different views. So, ideally for you, like the form of government that you would advocate for, what would that look like? And how would you how would you deal with like the people who have the theocratic views?
Well, what we call for is, first of all, the people of Iran have to decide on the final government and how
Mm,
that forms. For the interim government, we do propose a 6-month interim government, and then there will be elections held under the eye of the international community, where it will be creating like the constitutional assembly. That constitutional assembly will come up with a new constitution, which will be put to vote by the people.
mm,
And then the elections would be set based on the new rules of the republic for the people of Iran to make that decision. But for the interim government, we do, the NCRI has the plan for the interim government. It is outlined, I guess, like kind of like the cliff notes of this interim government plan would be the 10-point plan presented by Mrs. Rajavi. She's the president-elect of the Iranian resistance for the interim government.
mhm,
Its main concentration is on the transfer of sovereignty to the people of Iran, but it calls for separation of religion and state. It calls for, you know, the ballot box being the final criterion. It calls for gender equality. It calls for recognizing the rights of Iran's ethnicities and the autonomy of Iran's ethnicities. It
mm,
calls for the rights of religious minorities and the different groups in Iran. It calls for a free market, you know, society. And so when you look at the 10-point plan, it really does create like safeguards to make sure that you don't derail into any
mhm,
dictatorship or the authoritarian state. Keeps you in that line of, you know, secular democratic republic. It has garnered the support of over 4,000 lawmakers around the world, and including the majority of the U.S. Congress for years, actually for a decade, over a decade every single year. But also, like for instance, over 130 former heads of state have supported this 10-point plan, or over 100 Nobel laureates have supported it. So it has garnered a lot of international support throughout the years. And what's important is the fact that, as I said, it's not just mere words. People see it in the
mm,
practices of this movement and where it stands. So I think that's really important. And I think also for, especially for the women of Iran, because they have been systematically suppressed so much, it is very inspiring to see a woman leading this movement for not just, you know, 1 or 2 years. I mean, for
mhm.
that 4 decades. And, you know, it hasn't been a easy battle, but she is really the one force that the regime can't reckon with and has to. And it's very liberating to see that and inspiring too. And I think that the fact that she has been able to lead this movement despite all the obstacles, it has really allowed us to grow as a movement. And
Mhm.
and that is what we're seeing. And I think that's what the regime fears a lot because, like, for instance, all the secretary generals of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iraq since 1989 till today have been women. And that's up against a misogynist regime. So it has a message for, the people of Iran. And it's really like 180 degrees opposites on everything.
Mhm.
So I think that that is what people feel like they can trust. And that's why they're willing to make push sacrifices. As I said, we know that no one's going to hand us freedom on a silver platter, but we are willing to pay that price. And so it's time to allow the people of Iran to take their destiny into their own hands because no one has that right other than the people to
Mhm.
do that. And democracies can't be installed. It's been proven time and time again.
How poetic would it be to have a woman-led movement be the thing that tops the Ayatollah and the theocracy? That I am pulling for that so hard.
So early because that's like, that is pure justice and favor.
Well, if people want to find out more about you and more about this movement, how can they do that?
Well, you could visit ncr-iran.org to learn more about the National Council of Resistance of Iran, which is like the umbrella group in Parliament in Exile, and to learn more about Maryam Rajavi, because her viewpoint I think is very interesting for most to learn about. You could visit Maryam-Rajavi.com or
Mhm.
maryamrajavi.com. And if you would like to become active wherever you are with the Iranian diaspora who are working right now, they could really use every support that they can get in these critical times. But if you're in the US, you can reach out to Organization of Iranian American Communities. It's oiac.org. They have chapters in over 40 states, and you're probably covered there. They do a lot of activity on the ground in different areas, but also in capital cities. And if you are outside of the US, you could reach out to iranfreedom.org and they could put you in contact with a local chapter.
Zolal, this has been so fascinating. Thank you very much for your time and thank you for acting out with me.
Thank you very much, Adam. It was a pleasure to be with you and enjoyed the conversation.